U.S. stripped of AAA rating by Fitch as budget deficits swell. This is a Bloomberg story. Fitch ratings downgraded U.S. debt from AAA to AA plus due to consumers overswelling budget deficits, with the federal deficit reaching $1.39 trillion for the first 9 months of the current fiscal year, up 170% from previous year. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen called the downgrade arbitrary and outdated, but Fitch justified the move, citing potential deterioration in the country's finances over the next 3 years due to tax cuts, now spending initiatives, economic shocks, and political gridlock. Despite the downgrade, the bond market remained relatively stable, but risk-sensitive assets took a hit, with Europe's stock 600 index tumbling the most in a month. The downgrade underscores the worsening U.S. fiscal outlook, with Fitch forecasting the debt-to-GDP ratio to rise to 118% by 2025, more than 2.5 times higher than AAA median of 39.3%. Graham, when you see this, you're in the real estate space. Some guys are saying it's not a big deal. You're overreacting. Stop. This isn't anything. It's just this. It's just that. And then there's some that saying this is pretty bad. I mean, Kevin O'Leary came out and said this is not anything that's regular. This is very bad on what's going on here.
Yeah.
Where do you stand with this?
I think a default should never even be in the conversation. The fact that we even have headlines that say, "Oh, the U.S. risks a default," should never even be a consideration. The fact that it is, and it's being used as a leverage point, I think is awful.
Totally
It
agree.
shouldn't be used as that. There should be no question whatsoever that the U.S. is going to pay its debts on time, as agreed, always. So the fact that this is being used as a possible scenario in the past for negotiation, I think is awful. But, I mean, they're not exactly wrong with what they say. So I think in the long term, is this going to matter? Probably not. But I do think all the concerns that they bring up I don't see any issue with them. I mean, they're not wrong.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, and I think this is serious. And I actually disagree that this is not serious. And you didn't, the second part of the you would say in Spanish, la noticia of the information is the same week that the federal government was negotiating the debt ceiling increase. Same week, Miami got a credit rating increase to its highest level ever, S&P. So you can Google that, Miami S&P rating, same exact week. So running for president, because I'm here to talk about Miami and what I did in Miami, but I also want to translate into how it makes me a good presidential candidate. I'm the only candidate, period, that has cut a public sector budget. Full stop. 20%. The delta between our income and our expenses as a federal budget is a 20% gap right now. It's going to be ugly. Very ugly. I've done it. It's going to be very ugly. Number two, I inherited a bankrupt city. When I got, people look at Miami and, 14% growth, this is great, whatever, blah, blah, blah. I inherited a bankrupt city. My city, on day one, 2009, when I got elected, I was the only public official that didn't get elected with union support because I wouldn't lie to my employees. I told them we're going to have to cut costs and it's going to come out of you. We're not going to raise taxes. And that's exactly what we did. Okay. We had to balance a $600 million budget to 450 approximately. $115 million we had to cut from our budget. 115 in 1 year, by the way. We didn't get a 4-year phase in, a 5-year phase in, nothing. We now have the highest reserves ever. We're going to have a super high individual year surplus and the highest bond rating ever. We were fiscally sound. We tightened our belt. We did things that government doesn't do, which is be disciplined and do what every American does, though. Every American bounces a checkbook, hopefully, right? And this is what we should be promoting in our country, right? Savings, like you said. And so I think this is a big issue. To your point, they've postponed it till after the presidential election, which I thought was, I don't think that's a good, I don't think that's a good idea. I think it's wrong. So the next president's going to have to walk right into that. By the way, when I first got elected mayor, so I confronted this deficit in 2009 as commissioner, and then I had to reconfront it as mayor because we got sued by our labor partners. 13 lawsuits. We won 12 out of the 13. The 13th we lost at the Florida Supreme Court. Okay, it was a $700 million liability in our budget. And I said to the guys, I said, look, I didn't lie to you in 2009 when I told you we were not going to be able to raise taxes and we're not going to be able to increase your compensation. We had to cut your compensation. We did tiered salary cuts, pension cuts, et cetera. Never done before in the history of Miami. I'm not going to lie to you now. If you bankrupt the city of Miami, when we just grew 10.5%, everything is gone. All your cookies, all the stuff, it's all gone. And they believed me and they listened to me. And so I negotiated that debt down for, I think it was 18 cents on the dollar, from 700 million to 50 million. We didn't even pay it all up front. We paid like 20 million up front and 10 million over 3 years. And so, look, you have to, that's where the private sector, public sector experience is important.
Let me ask
any
you.
word on Fitch, and then I'm going to come to you, and then go ahead.
First of all, it's not what happens to our bonds, because Jamie Dimon and Janet Yellen are saying two slightly different things, but they can both be right. Jamie Dimon says it doesn't really affect the U.S. government debt because the price is determined by the market, and people are still going to be buying billions and billions of dollars of government debt of the countries like Japan and China that speculate and hold U.S. government debt. So that's going to change much. What does change is the waterfall effect in the capital markets across the globe, because you saw what happened. The European bond market dropped. So there was real loss of value on one day in the European bond market because Fitch drops on U.S. And although we've had headlines about defaults, have we ever defaulted? You know, the debt ceiling is just the next version of a Marvel movie, and it's kind of pathetic. You know the world's going to get saved. You just look at your watch and say, it's going to be at about 2 hours and 15 minutes into the movie. And I think it's pathetic. Because
I got to disagree a little bit with you on that.
Well, it kicks the can down the road. Yeah. Every time we raise the debt ceiling.
I hear you. I have to disagree a little bit with you on that, because I think what happens, and you see this in the history of conflict, right? To your point, this debt ceiling debate, or whatever you want to call it, right? It's a standoff, right? A Mexican standoff, or and what's going to happen is, which is what happens when there's nuclear war, right? Is sometimes neither side flinches, right? Both sides dig in for whatever reason, whatever their reasons are, and I think, to your point, not solving the problem, continuing to kick the can down 6 months, a year and a half, there will be a moment where both sides will dig in, thinking that the consequences will not be as bad as what they will be. It will happen. And I think I believe personally, and of course it's like saying, what is Putin going to do next? I mean, who knows, right? Who can get into his mind? I believe that the consequences will be dramatic and dire. That's what I believe. Maybe it will never happen because of that reason, right? Maybe, hopefully, or maybe a president like me gets elected and decides we got to balance our budget. Like, this has to be the number one priority, because, by the way, we haven't even talked about inflation and interest rates, or what I call Bidenomics, the poor get poor, right? In Bidenomics, right? Through increased inflation and interest rates. Most people have their money in bank accounts, so they lose purchasing power. They want to buy a house. They gotta pay more in interest, so they get squeezed on both ends. But if that doesn't happen, if we don't, by the way, we're living on fictitious money.
I agree.
20%. Right? It's a huge delta. I mean, this is a huge delta. So to bring that back into line, it's going to take discipline, it's going to take pain, and it's going to take good tax policy that will grow us out of it at some level. But it's going to take reducing expenses, which we hopefully are prepared to do.
Mayor Suarez, I have a sort of a policy and personality question for you, right? So you talked about the Project Possible, right? So there's people that's listening that are like, hey, I like this guy.
Yeah.
Super likable guy, but he's in Miami. It's Miami. Yeah. I'm in Iowa. I'm in New Hampshire. Yeah. I'm in South Carolina. What is he going to do for me, right? Yeah. So number one, how can you take the Miami model and extrapolate that for nationally? Nationally? Yeah. And then, like we highlighted before, politics is so divisive. Yeah. Right now, but I mean, I don't know if the camera can consensus. You're a super likable,
thank you,
aspirational, positive, optimistic guy. That's sort of your message for America. For sure. From a policy perspective, debt, GDP, like Graham was talking about, inflation, but also just getting along, being a synergist, coming to Washington. How can you take what you've done to Miami, the Miami model, economically, but also personality-wise? Yeah. What could you bring to DC?
Well, I hope I can convey the personality, that I have the right personality, that I'm a consensus builder, that I'm a unifier, and that's based on my record as getting elected by 85%, reelected by 80%, and changing a county that was plus 30 for Democrats into one that's plus 10 for Republicans based on our policies. But in addition to that, the biggest problems that we confront as a nation have to be confronted by someone who has experience confronting them, right? And so I would say the first problem is our deficit. and rampant inflation and rising interest rates. We got to get control of that. I'm the only candidate, you can look it up, you can do the research, that has actually cut a public sector budget by the same percentage that we have to cut our federal budget. The only one that has that experience, right? So I have the personality, the skill set, and the experience to deal with that problem. Problem number 2, immigration. I don't think that there is a better person capable of dealing with immigration, which is a multifaceted, complex problem, than a Hispanic Republican president. Why? Because you got to control the border. You've got to, I think depowering China is a big part of dealing with immigration. And we can get into that if you want, but it's a complex sort of analysis. You've got to deal with, you got to right-size legal immigration. And I think that has not been pegged to objective metrics like growth, like the need for skilled and unskilled labor, the declining birth rate, et cetera. Immigration, in terms of legal immigration, should be pegged to those factors and should float with those factors, right? So that we may need 2x, 3x the number of legal immigrants. I don't know what that right number is, but there has to be a formula to solve it for America's benefit, right? And I think then you got to deal with the undocumented, and I think a Hispanic Republican can help demystify that problem. As you were saying, Pat, you do this a lot in Rogan's, and you've done some of it today. You know, at some level, as partisan politicians, we're always counting votes. Right? Is this going to benefit me as a party? Is it going to hurt me as a party? I'm not likely to support a policy that may hurt me as a party, as I am likely to support a policy that may benefit me as a party. And I think being a Hispanic Republican president, you are in effect telling the Republican Party, hey, having immigrants is a positive thing for this country, and if they're Hispanic, this could benefit the Republican Party as opposed to be a detriment. You talked about some of the polling numbers, right? We can shift that and change that dynamic, which changes the argument in many ways.
So if you like this clip and you want to watch another one, click right here. And if you want to watch the entire podcast, click right here.